Nice to be with you today. I very much enjoyed the previous space panel where we all learned that all our iPhones are connected to space. These iPhones are also full of rare earths and rare metals, which have rare earths and rare metals have certain qualities to allow us to have things like this iPhone, smaller, lighter, more durable, from jet engines to semiconductors to satellites. They are really crucial. As I mentioned yesterday, the Japanese call rare earths and rare metals industrial or technology vitamins. A very small amount makes everything work better, much higher performance, which is why they're so important in the technology century that we live in. Now, rare earths, let's start with just very briefly what are rare earths, because it sounds very mysterious. If you remember back to your high school chemistry, the second from the bottom row, those are the rare earths. There's 17 of them, but there's really only 4 or 5 of them that are really important. And they're very important in permanent magnets, which are in, for example, electric vehicles and F-35 fighters. They make machines move, basically. The 4 or 5 of them probably constitute about 90% of the value of rare earths. So that's the 17 rare earths. Now, U.S. used to dominate the production in our main, really our only rare earths mine, which is in Mountain Pass, California. It's had a very troubled history. It went bankrupt and now has been reconstituted as MP Partners, which is a private equity firm. There's a Chinese partner, believe it or not, that has a 9% stake. We can talk a little bit about Mountain Pass. The new management is doing some things right, and it's going in the right direction, but this is really why I got interested 5-6 years ago. I'm not a metallurgist, I'm an Asia and emerging markets analyst, and I saw how dependent U.S. industry was on Chinese rare earths. For some time, China has produced roughly 80% of the world's rare earths. It's interesting, in 1978-79, Deng Xiaoping famously was quoted as saying, Saudi Arabia has oil, China has rare earths. And they very steadily picked up market share and developed the industry just roughly something like this. In the 1970s, they produced rare earth concentrate, which is like a cocktail of all the rare earths inside. In the 90s, it began to develop the technology to what they call separation. That's taking that cocktail and taking each one of those 17 rare earths out and isolating them. This is a very environmentally damaging process, and which is another reason why China took it over, because the U.S. environmental safeguards made it very difficult for Mountain Pass to do it. And then in the 90s, they started to go to the next step. You take the rare earths and you use them to form metals, magnets, polishing powders, and then lastly in the 2000s, they started to incorporate them in final products, electric motors, computers, batteries, mobile phones. And that's where we got where we are. The only other major producer, and the U.S. government is working with this company, it's an Australian company called Linus. They produce about 15% of the world's rare earths. Right now, the mine is in Australia, Mount Weld, and they do the processing in Malaysia. They plan to open another processing plant in Texas with U.S. government support, so that's a good sign. But it's very interesting how we let this happen, how we let China dominate this industry. The Wall Street Journal just recently noted that the F-35 production line was held up due to Chinese rare earth content in permanent magnets in the F-35 fighter. And as you can imagine, rare earths and their cousin, what I would call rare metals. So let's stop here just for a moment. You have the 17 rare earths, but there's many, many other rare metals, which are also just as important, if not more important. For example, germanium for fiber optics and satellites, gallium for semiconductors and permanent magnets. All these markets, they're just small markets. They're opaque, they're fragile, easily disrupted and manipulated. For example, copper. Everybody knows copper, very important metal. About 20 million tons of copper is produced each year. Nickel, another important metal, about 3 million tons. Whereas some of these rare earths, if you add all the rare earths together, it's about 200,000 metric tons. About half of those are not that important. So now you're down to about 100,000 metric tons. Scandium, which is very important for naval shipbuilding, aircraft, 20 metric tons a year production. Unbelievably small market. And then I would say the rare metals, also known as minor metals, strategic metals, critical metals, tech metals, sort of tops out at about 200,000 metric tons a year. So that's how small these markets are and how important they are. Now, in defense, I would just say that the Congressional Research Service estimates it's about 920 pounds of rare earths to make an F-35 fighter, 5,200 to make a destroyer, 9,200 pounds to make a Virginia-class submarine. And as tension is rising in Asia, the pressure and the possibility of conflict over rare earths is definitely there. And I don't know if anyone recalls, but roughly 10 years ago, a Japanese Coast Guard vessel collided with a Chinese trawler in the East China Sea near Senkaku, the disputed island. And the Japanese basically took the ship, the trawler, let the crew go, but kept the captain for questioning. The Chinese lost it completely and basically, for a brief time, about a week, embargoed rare earths exports to Japan. Japan was completely dependent on rare earths and has none. And this led to a tremendous spike in rare earth prices. And ever since then, people have been spooked about them and worried about the availability. And so if America can more fully develop the Mountain Pass mine, also work with Linus to do the refining, because the refining is really the key issue. We need to find new technologies to do it cleaner, more safely, more economical. That's all those things are important, because the price. There's another reason that Apple makes 90% of their products in China, besides low-cost labor and low-cost land. That's where the rare earths are. One of them, neodymium. You wouldn't believe, but a neodymium magnet is right here in your speaker. That's a tiny little magnet. A regular car has hundreds of magnets, and that brings me to clean tech, clean energy, whatever you want to call it. As Congressman Smith said, the transition to a renewable energy future will not be easy. The typical electric car requires 6 times more inputs of rare earths and 3,000 microchips. And the present scarcity and concentration of production in China and other countries unfriendly to the U.S. suggests that conflict over these strategic materials is definitely going to grow. And then there's the paradox of clean tech. All the critical metals necessary for wind turbines, solar panels, electric vehicle engines and magnets, such as cobalt, gallium, lithium, germanium, rare earths, are far scarcer than petroleum and anything but clean. So we can talk more about Mountain Pass. As I mentioned, they are expanding. They're trying to be able to refine the material. Right now, they have to ship it to China. So technically speaking, the U.S. produces 0 rare earth oxides right now. They make the concentrate in Mountain Pass, they ship it to China, and it disappears into the marketplace. They're working on doing it here, they're refining here, which would be a major milestone. And then they also want to go a further step and make the permanent magnets in the United States. So slowly but surely, unfortunately too slowly, we're filling in the supply chain. And so we just need to accelerate it. And wherever Congress can help in terms of funding to move things faster, I think it would be welcome. I'll just say one final comment. What happens when everybody starts talking about rare earths is that every junior mine, I shouldn't say every, many junior mines in Canada, the United States, South America, suddenly change from a silver mine or a copper mine into a rare earth mine. They all want funding, and so they use it as a marketing tool. We're going to solve our problem. And so my 501c, the Hay Seward Economic Security Initiative, is basically monitoring these hundreds of junior miners and trying to figure out the 10 or 12 that are really worth supporting. So I think I'll stop there and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Dennis Bartow, if you make your presentation, thank you.
Sir, good to
Thank
see
you,
you
my
again.
friend. Good to see you,
All
too.
right, all right. All right, everybody, how are you? Congressman Pittenger, thank you for having me and the Washington Intelligence Policy Forum. It's a real honor to be here. So my name is Dennis Bartow. I'm the president and founder of Parliamentary Incorporated. We are what we like to fashion as great power competition or strategic competition experts. I've listened to all the speakers, and these are all very, very well-informed folks in various policy and other industry matters. So trying to shape exactly what I would say as a complement to the conversation and hopefully be a little bit intriguing to you for some question and answer later. But my background, I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Africa Policy. I was the Pentagon's senior policy maker and advisor. And Congressman Smith, I don't know if he's still around, but we could rant together about DRC and some of those issues for sure. And then I was also the DoD Small Business Director. So I was the first appointed small business director in 5 years at the Pentagon, a direct report to the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Much of my time in the last number of years, previous to that, I was at Interpol's Washington office in their counterterrorism division, working Africa issue, illicit trafficking in the Gulf of Guinea, and things like that. So a lot of what I've done over the past decade plus and 30 years in the military has been in countering illicit activities in various ways, but over the past few years in strategic ways, focusing on, like I said, that strategic power or strategic competition, great power competition world. So essentially, I represented the Pentagon at a thing called Prosper Africa, which was the interagency's framework to increase two-way trade between the continent and the United States. As DASD and as part of the office, we looked at various different commodities on the continent for various strategic access and strategic denial, and we had identified 16 mines on the continent, a couple of uranium and a bunch of other things that we did everything we could to get a U.S. mining firm to go over there to take them over. The The Africans are begging for it. The Africans want trade, not aid. They'll tell you that. If the Africans present, I'm sure you can back that up. Rwanda wants to be the Silicon Valley of Africa. I'm actually working with a company to do space launches in Africa, in Rwanda, I should say, as well, just as an aside. But when we look at these issues from a broad strategic standpoint, all the valid points that we've talked about, the Chinese dominance in the industry. One of my colleagues said, we've already lost. I mean, we've lost Africa. We've lost the processing, the access, the extraction as a country. And that's a sad thing to hear. But since the 80s, when the Chinese really took over the global raw materials supply chain in every regard, I mean, everything we have is grown or mined. Everything, all the food, every chair in here, all the microphones, everything we've talked about are grown or mined. And even though the United States is still number 2 in critical materials extraction and production, we send it all to China for processing. We talked about Linus. We talked about MP Materials. We didn't talk about USA Rare Earths. But there are a number of folks that are trying desperately to get something going, kind of picking over the corpse of a previous, operation, which is often the case. But we have not actually had a new greenfield, which is a new mine in this country, for 40 years. So I was honored to be a small part of an IPO here in the United States that was done on private lands, on already used copper mines, with better technology to kind of get at some better stuff. And that's about as good as we've gotten for almost a generation now in the United States. A lot of the things that are still in production, copper and others, they're 80, 100 years. A lot of them are reaching their end state. And then you have situations where you have the twin mines in Minnesota, which is our best nickel deposit overall. It was shut down. It's been sued about 19 different times. For those that were following it, there was $2.8 billion given out by the administration. $107 million, I believe, was given to Talon mines, which for a processing facility, and they're not even in production. So and the average in the United States, as an aside, it takes about 14, 15 years to get a new mine going. Canada, about 5 years. Australia, about the same. So I guess where I'm getting at, whether we talk policy or we talk what legislators could do, the reality is we have to compete, to outcompete the Chinese and other malign influencers, near-peer competitors. We need to support our partners and allies around the world, predominantly the Australians, the Canadians, the Brits, the Kiwis, and others that are out there scratching the earth and doing patriotic work to keep the Chinese at bay. They're always looming at every deal. Most of the mining companies, I should swerve into what I have been doing the past 2 years since leaving government, is work with some of the globe's best mining and mineral houses. And believe it or not, one of the things that we provide as a service is keeping it quiet, okay? Spouting whales get harpooned. Every one of these projects has somebody looming, the Chinese, the nation. I mean, if we can look at an example in Mexico where they nationalized their lithium. And we talked about Congo. We don't need to talk about when it turned into Zaire and kicked all of the industries out from the West and others. So that is part of it. I have a client that they have manganese and they don't want anybody to know because their government will probably nationalize it like they did other minerals in that country. So it's a huge challenge. And one of the things that I've done, again, over the last 2 years in government, helped to kind of set the table some of the broad strategic policies within the interagency, mostly the Pentagon, but working with State Department, aid, other interagency colleagues in various agencies, is try to set the table to support industry when they're doing things around the planet. And when you talk about strategic competition or defense support for economics, as I would call it, is industry is very, very, very open to supporting our global strategic priorities whether it be buying up a port or developing something. They just need some help from the government to let them do that. So we talked about various, ways to get at human rights and environmental rights abuses, whether it be through Child Soldier Protection Act, the Kimberley process for deconflicting conflict minerals, Child Soldier Protection Act. These are all things, by the way, that, that's your day-to-day in the Africa policy world. They're all great and they're all fantastic, but our values travel as far as our influence, okay? Remember that. If you don't remember anything else I say about this global discussion on mining and minerals, your values travel as far as your influence. If you want influence in these countries in Africa or the Middle East or in the Indo-Pacific region, you have to have some sort of influence over them to push all the gold standard things we talk about. And the reason, frankly speaking, that we have so much conflict minerals in Central Africa is because we just don't care about it. We really don't care about it. I can pull up 20 years worth of videos on the human rights just hell on earth that these kids live through, getting cancers early, having mines collapse on them multiple times a year if they survive. They have no other options, but a lot of that is because of the feel-good things that we try to do to get at abuses when we actually create a more illicit situation. You have black markets in mining and minerals. You have